I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And I'm thrilled that those of you who are on the East Coast of the United States in this gorgeous midsummer afternoon, that so many people are joining us live for this really important discussion, which we have titled The Shifting Military Balance Across the Taiwan Straits. I will be brief in my introduction because if you see on the screen, we have an additional participant in today's dialogue, which is Admiral Dennis Blair, who not only is director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, but is our former PACOM commander. It was PACOM back there, not back then, not INDOPACOM, and also our director of national intelligence. We initially recruited two of America's outstanding experts on the Taiwan Straits, on the military balance in the Taiwan Straits, Oriana Skylar Mastro and Lyle Goldstein. Oriana is currently in Australia. So she is, as I said a minute ago, a Laodong Moafang, a labor hero for being up at what is now 6 a.m. It was 5:50 a.m. when I first saw her. But her current job is as a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. And she focuses on Chinese military and security policy. And she wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, which I hope you all have seen, which has actually provoked this program. So she is also, I should not leave out, very importantly, a fellow at the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And participating in this program is exactly what we hope the fellows do, and we thank you so much for doing that. Lyle Goldstein is a research professor in the China Maritime Studies Institute at the Naval War College, an old friend. He is also one of the leading authorities on kind of the PLAN, the PLA, and Taiwan Strait issues. So what we'll do is we'll have Lyle kick it off. We'll go to Oriana, and then we'll go to Admiral Blair. Admiral Blair has an appointment at 4:30, so he will need to drop off the call at that point. But assuming Lyle and Oriana stay to their times, we'll have plenty of time to hear from Admiral Blair. But let me turn it over to Lyle. I know you're going to share some of your screen with us, but thanks for joining us.
Well, it's great to be with everyone today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us on this extremely important issue here. Let me say right up front, very emphatically, that these are my own opinions. They don't in any way reflect a official assessment of the Navy or the U.S. government either. But I did figure that showing a few, I spend a lot of time every day looking at Chinese news, Chinese military news in particular, and this is not material that most Americans are aware of, that see on a daily basis. So I thought I had better share some of that to show you we're really in kind of dire straits, folks. The warnings are piled up. Professor Mastro covered that brilliantly in her recent Foreign Affairs piece. You know, I see this almost every day, literally, from Luo Yuan just 2 days ago. He says there's a countdown, and you know, I think we ignore these warnings at our peril. That's my view. Why is this happening now? Well, Professor Mastro again covers that very well in her piece. She raised the issue of Hong Kong. I guess my view on that is that this has been going on for quite a long time, though. It's not really new. You know, here's a quote from the famous Chinese strategist Zhang Wenmu saying, "Hey, you know, Mr. Putin can take Crimea. Why can't we take Taiwan?" So I mean, you know, Taiwan threats are not at all new, really, and go back a long time. And indeed, they have so many buttons they can push. We might see a massive show of force, and we all know the flights across the median line have been increasing. We can talk about those some, but this gets worse, folks. I mean, China has a massive coast guard they can pull into this too, but I mean, this goes all the way up to nuclear signaling. And you can bet when I took this screenshot in the lower right back in January 2017, this was right after Trump's call from Tsai Ing-wen. I guess it was in December, but the this was on the news in January, and I think it was probably related. This is not a garbage truck. That's a DF-41 that can hit, destroy Chicago or something. Again, they have many things that they can do. The blockade, as Professor Mastro pointed out in her piece, looks like a very feasible scenario. They have all kinds of ways to cut off Taiwan, including capabilities. People, we all think about submarines and China's Navy and so forth, but look at the lower where that red arrow is. Okay, China's been thinking hard about how they can deal with our capabilities, including our submarines, for example. Can talk more about that. But it could look like a limited attack. Here are the Penghu Islands. You can see a small map. I've reviewed some of that geography and some of the defenses. I think Penghus are quite vulnerable. This could be quite tempting for China in a kind of limited way. That, by the way, that would reflect a historical Chinese attack on Taiwan, which came through the Penghus. But what about an all-out attack? And here, I guess we'll take some time and maybe have some interesting disagreement. People do disagree on this question. A lot of people make it about the big amphibious attack ships. As you see, this is type 075 where the red arrow pointed at it. Yeah, we can talk about that, but in my view, it is a bit of a mistake, a bit of a red herring to focus just on that. Look, this is less than 90 miles across the strait. You don't need very fancy equipment to get across that strait. And, if you watch Chinese military news the way I do, you can see exactly how they're going to do it. It's going to be low tech. It's going to involve tens of thousands of civilian ships. It's not going to be fancy gear. Rather, low tech is going to be the way to go. This is a good solution for China because who wants to spend a torpedo or a fancy cruise missile? I think we call it El Razum these days. These boats don't even merit that kind of war shot on our part. But there are other pieces of this too, which look fairly dire for Taiwan. There is a very robust airborne piece, and China is working very hard on its airborne pieces. Forces. Look at the red arrow in the center there, right? That's a night jump. People don't do that much. Clearly, they have something in mind. Look in the bottom right again at the red arrow. These airborne forces now will be supplemented by very formidable drone forces. And just looking at the time here, but helicopters are another new piece of this, which changed the game. And as you can see from these various pictures, there is a tremendous amount going on here. China learned a lot of this from us. And look at the red arrow again in the top left. Those are fuel tanks. Allow the helicopters to get across the strait. And then in the lower middle, even the People's Armed Police. That's 500,000 strong. Don't really think about them in a Taiwan context. We should, because they're increasingly, I think, part of the equation here. I can talk more about this. But look, all of this is dependent on a massive firepower strike that forces the Taiwan defenders way underground. And China has more than enough firepower, in the missile forces, rocket artillery now allows them to do it economically. Drones, like I said, and then I didn't even mention the PLA Air Force, which will be tasked with this as well. They're doing their homework, folks. They looked at the historical precedents, and I looked some at this recently. They understand it's all about deception, absolutely, and they've studied Normandy upside down and backwards. I can tell you, Incheon as well. They understood the key to Incheon was they went where the enemy least expected it, right? So you must expect the unexpected here, and surprise is the key to everything. The Chinese understand this fully. Mobilization, another key to this, and could walk you through all their lessons of the Falklands and so forth, but they were so impressed by how the British mobilized civilian assets, and that is the absolute key to China's planning here and why they're likely to be successful. So my bottom line, and we can put this slide up again later if you want to discuss some of the issues here, and you'll see you may be puzzled by some of the issues here figure on both sides, because I think it's sort of indeterminate which way they go. The issue of allies, for example. But let's focus on the underlines here. Surprise on the one hand, and also interior lines. What do interior lines mean? It means they can, the Chinese can put much more firepower into this scenario than we can, certainly during the first couple of months. And that will be decisive in my view. So sorry to give you a kind of dark vision, but I think this is more or less a fait accompli. So let me stop there and I'll stop sharing here and turn it to my capable colleague. Very honored to join this panel here today.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me. As Steve mentioned, I participated in the Great Public Intellectuals program that the National Committee has a few cohorts ago. It was an exceptional experience, not only to get a little bit more training to be a public-facing intellectual that helped me with such things like writing this article for Foreign Affairs, but also connected me to a lot of other scholars that work on various aspects of China that have since become some of my closest colleagues, friends, and confidants. As was mentioned, I had an article in the last issue of Foreign Affairs that they called the Taiwan Temptation, which I laid out a series of reasons why I think Chinese thinking is shifting towards a consideration of armed reunification. Now, I'm not arguing that this is inevitable. What I'm trying to raise the alarm about is that there is this conventional wisdom that I think there's three parts of it, but there's a conventional wisdom that China would never use force against Taiwan, short of a situation in which Taiwan declared independence. The calculation goes something like, they wouldn't want to risk it, they could never win, they would be international pariahs. This would be the end of the regime. The economic costs would be too high, et cetera, et cetera. What I tried to do in my article is lay out the reasons why I think a lot of these factors, which were absolutely true 20 years ago, are no longer true. And like a lot of things of assessing Chinese capabilities, intentions, it's important for us to update our understanding of what is going on. Now, I don't know if I'm cursed or I'm lucky, but apparently this article has sparked a lot of debate. And part of that is that Foreign Affairs is now going to run a response piece. They've had 3 pieces submitted in response to my own, and they've asked me in a day, which was actually yesterday, to write my response to what was being said. So I want to, in just a few minutes, lay out some of the main reasons that people disagree with this argument, that China is now more seriously considering, in their words, armed reunification, and sort of my views on why these counter arguments are not so persuasive. So the types of things that people have laid out in response to my piece are really nothing new. They don't provide any new evidence, so they haven't necessarily convinced me that I'm incorrect. They are, however, very clear articulations of the conventional wisdom, which I was trying to debunk the first time around. Maybe I wasn't successful across the board, so now I have a second chance. So the sort of 3 main assumptions I would say is 1, that China doesn't have the military capabilities to pull it off. 2, that the economic costs are sufficient to deter Xi Jinping. And 3, China can wait forever, indefinitely, to achieve what I see as their most important national goal of reunification. So this sort of ambiguous question of, why can't China wait? Now, Lyle has very clearly laid out some of the issues with the military capabilities. As I say in my article, there is a debate about the joint island landing campaign. I think most China military specialists think that they can do the other campaigns they're preparing for, right? Joint missile campaign, shooting a bunch of missiles at Taiwan, easy. Blockade, Lonnie Henley recently in a testimony to the USCC laid out very clearly why they would be successful in that case. Counterintervention, preventing the United States from intervening effectively. They've been able to do this for quite some time. The big debate is about this joint island landing campaign. And as Lyle laid out very clearly, I think one of the issues of the debate is people are looking at different factors. Even some of my critics look at what the United States would want to have to do that campaign, and then says, well, China doesn't have that, so they can't do it. Or making historical comparisons of what it took for the United States to fight Japan. Is that really what it's going to take China to fight Taiwan? I would say that at the height of World War II, the Japanese military was 6 million people that had decades of combat experience. I don't want to be dismissive of the Taiwan military, but we're talking about a situation that the army consists of 88,000 people, and of the 2.5 million reservists, maybe 300,000 get a 5-week refresher course every once in a while. I think these comparisons are not necessarily valid. One of the main points that was brought up, and this goes to what Lyle was talking about, is that maybe all of this is a lie. Maybe the Chinese are engaged in a massive disinformation campaign in which they're presenting us in these Chinese language sources with all this stuff to convince us that they are now more capable than they are. I would first say that I have studied, the Chinese military for a long time. No one, myself, Lyle, anyone takes what China says at face value. They do sometimes have the tendency to exaggerate, but they also, I think most of the time, in their public-facing Chinese language, they have the tendency to understate. This is how we get claims of the defense minister at Shangri-La saying they've never attacked another neighbor. This is how we get, they're not militarizing the South China Sea. Their strategy is usually to understate what's going on, to try to delay any sort of response. Now, in the cases they do exaggerate, the United States has independent means of verifying a lot of this. It's not the case that scholars and strategists just take what China says at face value. Indeed, whether it's the annual report to Congress that the Department of Defense has to do, or the testimonies that go before the US-China Economic Security Review Commission, hundreds and hundreds of reports that are published by universities, think tanks, or other research institutes like the Rand Corporation, all associated with the Department of Defense, they have laid out that there are situations under which the United States could lose. Now, this isn't to say that it's a hopeless cause. It's just to say that before the United States would always win. And now there are situations under which they could lose. So this could be potentially encouraging to the Chinese. I mean, the point is well taken. This is not going to be maybe a cakewalk. Taiwan, of course, is going to get some shots in, but it doesn't have the ability to defend itself. And I think if the United States does make some significant changes to its force posture that improves its early warning, deals with the issue of surprise that Lyle pointed out, this could also have a deterrent effect on China. Second point, and I only have a few more minutes left, so I'll be just quick on this, is the economic considerations. In the article, I very clearly lay out that there are many reasons for China to think the economic costs are going to be acceptable. If it were the case, if they would, countries around the world would then cut off all their ties with China, not trade with China anymore, yeah, that cost is too high. But I think they are now integrated into the international system. They believe countries rely on them economically, and they've seen how countries react when they've done other unpopular things, and it's relatively muted response. So there are reasons to think that the costs would not be too high. And even so, even if there were significant economic costs, time and time again, history has showed us that when it's a choice between territory and the economic cost of seizing that territory, leaders choose the territory. Right, 80% of wars since the 1600s is about territories. And I would say if you looked at Xi Jinping's recent speech at the 100th anniversary, in which he warned against foreign attempts to bully or oppress China, the language he used did not suggest to me a leader that was not seriously considering or comfortable with sort of risk-acceptant, aggressive behavior. And I would also say that Xi Jinping's goals clearly do not stop at wealth and prosperity. Other countries, it takes an independent decision to try to become a great power. You can just be wealthy and leave it as is. I would say that's kind of where Japan is, but then it takes an independent decision to say, okay, I want to turn this wealth into great power status. And whether it is the Belt and Road Initiative, which has increased their power and influence, but at a great economic cost, a funding gap of $500 billion a year, to the militarization of the South China Sea, which has alienated a lot of their partners, all of these things suggest that they don't care as much about the economic cost as sovereignty, which is the most important thing. Now, since my time is up, I'll wait in the Q&A to talk about why Xi Jinping cannot wait. In my mind, this isn't scientific. If you can achieve something that you've wanted to achieve for a long time, why would you wait to achieve it? They are in a good position now, and it's possible that as the United States has recognized these challenges, that it's going to be harder in the future. And even if the United States is in decline in their view, Chinese thinking is that a country like the United States in decline becomes even more aggressive and more dangerous. So if they do believe the United States is in decline, they actually believe it'll be worse to wait than it would be to do it today. So I'm happy to take some more questions about some of this logic, but I think I'm on the same page with Lyle that for the first time in a long time, this is a serious consideration among the Chinese leadership to initiate a conflict versus just being a responsive scenario. And I hope that US strategists and decision makers take it as such.
Great, you've put a ton on the table there for discussion. So let me turn it over to Admiral Blair before getting to my questions.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. What I'm going to try to do is put myself in the position of a final conference among the Chinese leadership on whether they do this or whether they don't. And as I believe they would have to think through this scenario. I think if they come out at the end of that thought process that there is high risk that there could be consequences that are bad for China, then they don't. If they come out with a thinking process that says we can do this, handle all of the potential adverse consequences, then we would go ahead and make a move. Now, I completely agree with Lyle and with Oriana that things have changed in the last 20 years since I commanded the forces that would go to defend Taiwan if they were ordered and if that happened. But let me point out some of the fundamentals that haven't changed. Lyle talked about several, and Oriana did as well, several Chinese military gambits that would be short of invading the island, things like a blockade, things like a air and missile assault, taking the Penghu Islands, or something even simpler, taking the islands that are 3 to 5 miles offshore of China in Taiwan, all of which could be done. But when you think those through, what happens next after China has fired a lot of missiles, has put a blockade in for a while? If Taiwan were to give up and say, okay, I don't want to take any more punishment, I will join China as the 17th province, then okay, China wins. But that's not been the history of what most countries do when they're attacked. And if at that point Taiwan says, okay, you've made your initial move, but we're girding up. The United States is coming to our assistance. China's being condemned. We're going to hang on here. What choices does China have? They either back down or they escalate. And if they back down, then there is a new situation, but it's probably worse for China internationally. There certainly would be repercussions within Chinese power structures, having embarked on this dangerous military road and not succeeded in reunification with Taiwan. So they would have to escalate. So the way I see it with these intermediate steps, all of them lead you to having to be able to take and hold Taiwan with a military assault. And if you make one of these intermediate moves, your situation gets just that much worse for China, because the United States has more time to come to Taiwan's assistance. Other countries will take other economic and diplomatic moves against Taiwan, but you're in a worse military situation. So that brings you to this all-out assault. And Lyle showed, and I agree with him, these are all of the ideas that are being talked about in Chinese military academies and in their training sessions and in some of their acquisition programs. But let's look at the basic situation. The basic situation is that in order to conduct a successful military assault against a big, well-prepared, well-armed country, and I don't dismiss the Taiwanese armed forces. I went there for 7 years as a senior evaluator for their annual exercise, and they, like any other country, they've got troops that are trained and will fight if ordered. But the pulling off a successful assault depends on, and I don't care how many irregular civilian forces you have to take a beach, a major port, and then be able to get follow-on forces into your initial assault. And at that point, the maritime balance shifts. The invading country has to maintain sea and air control over the target area, over Taiwan, for example. And at that point, the job of the United States, if we were to join, and of Taiwan, is the sea denial role. And that basically boils down to sinking the large Chinese amphibious ships, which would be necessary to bring in the second and third echelon of forces in order to expand a beachhead, move out from it in order to take over the island. And this is not negated by having a bunch of Chinese special forces or People's Armed Police running around in the country. There are plenty of Taiwanese forces which are quite adequate to deal with them. It's it is relatively easy to sink large amphibious or other vessels in a confined area, like the route from Chinese ports to any sort of an invasion beachhead artificial harbors that they have established. Taiwan has lots of ways to do it. The United States has even more ways to do it, ways that the Chinese would not possibly be able to deal with. So I basically think their biggest vulnerability is in following on any initial toehold that they form, any beachhead that they take on the Taiwanese island. And I just don't think they can maintain it and resupply it. And Taiwan would have enough residual forces which have survived any sort of an initial barrage to go back and push them back out. By this time, the United States is fully aroused. Lots of American forces pouring in, air, Navy, and others, and it very low probability that China would be able to maintain, enlarge its foothold into taking over all of Taiwan. So I think that the briefing in the Central Military Committee, when China considers this option, is along the lines that I just stated. Yeah, there is a chance that things could break their way in a number of ways, as it did for, say, the Germans at Crete or in Crete or so on, and they could succeed. There is a chance that Taiwan would roll over and say, "Yep, we don't want damage. We give up. We'll join you." But these are I think are low probability situations. So it continues to be very high risk. The final point, I guess, is that China, with all of the rhetoric that Lyle Goldstein talked about and so on, has aroused both Taiwan and the United States and other countries that have an interest in the outcome, like Japan. So the United States was distracted with things in the Middle East. The Navy and the Air Force were not quite as distracted, and they've been making serious improvements in their capabilities. But now the United States is fully aware, putting large resources to making the risks even less. Taiwan has turned things around, has a good strategy, which they are funding, and which would make their part of the operation very dangerous for China. So I just think that the chances are the risks are extremely high for China, so high that they would not attempt it, and that we can keep it that way if we continue doing the smart things that we're doing. So Steve, let me go to I'm afraid I have to sign off, but if you can take it from there, and enjoyed being with you.
Great. Denny, thank you so much. I mean, that was very interesting, and comments, some disagreement, but not some agreement. I mean, I actually think that continuing to maintain sufficient defensive capabilities, both in the US and in Taiwan, are things that Lyle, Oriana, and you all agree. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
I don't think we have them, though. I think, all the thinking in the world doesn't change the fact that China has 39 air bases in the range of Taiwan, and the United States has 1. I mean, there are some significant operational disadvantages to the United States in this scenario, that while the United States is trying to figure out ways around it, it's not so easy to resolve, even with all the focus that we have on the issue now.
So what are, your conclusions? What does it mean that the US should be doing that it is not doing, both Lyle and Oriana?
Missiles in the second island chain. So I think that basically we have this cost and position viewpoint with China that I don't think is effective. I think if you ask Xi Jinping, would you trade in your Navy to get Taiwan? He would be willing to do that. And so we have to show him that it's not possible, that he will not succeed. And I didn't have a chance to ask Admiral Blair, but what I would have followed up with is, how long does it take that landing platform to sail that 80 miles? And then tell me how long it takes for the United States to get its submarines in position. I think that there is this window of opportunity, as Lyle was referring to, a surprise, in which, with all the willingness in the world, the United States just does not have the assets in the region to stop China. So if we did have land-based missiles in the second island chain. So these are the waters sort of beyond Taiwan, that we could have the firepower to saturate the strait to make it hard for them to make the crossing. But right now, I do think they believe they can make that crossing. And moreover, I don't see the doubt. I think before, the deterrent was strong because it wasn't only the case that the United States convinced China that it could not succeed, right? We had, an aircraft carrier was enough to convince China to stop harassing Taiwan because the United States had air superiority. But now China has a missile that can sink that carrier. And so we have lost air superiority in this area. So it wasn't only the case that we could stop them from doing it, we could also convince them that any attempt would be costly. But now, what is the cost of attempting? Like, let's play that out. They give it a try. Let's just say for whatever reason, it doesn't break their way. Maybe they just take a couple of offshore islands instead. Xi Jinping says he taught the Americans and the Taiwan separatists a lesson, and they try again another day. They're never going to lose Taiwan because they're a nuclear power. The United States does not have the will to fight a nuclear war. So hopefully our leaders would be smart enough never in a war termination type of situation to demand Taiwan independence. So what's the downside really of trying? I think that's a lot. It's not as costly.
That's a political analysis, very much more. In other words, you make right. In other words, my guess is a failed attempt not only would lead to the leadership change, it potentially would call into question the future of the Chinese Communist Party in China.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think Xi Jinping, what is a failed attempt? I mean, just look at Lyle and all of the propaganda. He says he fought the Americans, he taught them a lesson, and now they're in a better position than they were before. His plan all along was to do this. I think they turn stuff around in their favor all the time.
Lyle, you wanted to add some things here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say maybe where I disagree with the Admiral and both also Professor Mastro. I'm not sure, but I don't see really any silver bullets here, not anything close. To me, we're trying to solve a military problem, and the U.S. would always turn to some kind of fancy technology. I think Professor Mastro said we should line the second island chain with all kinds of missiles. I've thought that through some, and I've read a lot of Chinese analyses of that. Myself, I'm very skeptical. I mean, first of all, I don't see either the Filipinos or the Japanese signing up for all the kind of infrastructure it would take to line their islands with missiles. Moreover, I see no reason why China couldn't destroy those missiles, and that would put us in a kind of dangerous sort of arms race in that respect. Never mind all the environmental consequences and it's where the political sensitivities which cause me to think that's a very unrealistic scenario. But let's say we could put hundreds of missiles there. For what exactly? To sink some of those large landing ships that the Admiral talked about? I've said those are not critical. In fact, if anything, those are probably sponges to absorb all those missiles. Look, China well understands at Normandy, there were 5,000 ships off the beach, 5,000. In this scenario, there may be 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. How do you do targeting when you're looking at 20,000 ships, all with kind of radar arrays that mask their shape? It's an impossible problem. What I'm saying is that this is a military problem that, although we have a lot of smart people putting their efforts at this, but we are not going to solve the problem that this is 90 miles off China's coast. If Americans want to think about this a different way, think about Cuba. How would Cuba be defended against the United States if the United States was determined to take it and willing to pay more or less any cost, which I think China is willing to pay, and has the kind of focus and is willing to deploy both deception and in particular surprise. China will go for Taiwan when we least expect it. That's why I kind of disagree with various analysts who think we can read what they're writing and see whether that this might happen this year or next year. This is an impossible task, partly because it's the inverse. When they go quiet on Taiwan, you might expect them to come across. So it's a very difficult enterprise here we're talking about.
I'm the one non-military person on this panel. I don't understand how you could move 20,000 landing ships to the coast across from Taiwan and not have U.S. intelligence completely know what is going on and put in place defensive measures. Wouldn't that be obvious?
Well, let me explain. I mean, like I said, you don't, the idea of a landing ship, what does it mean? Right? We tend to think of Normandy and all those tanks rolling off those big ships. Actually, very few of those tanks made it across the beach in Normandy. They all sank. This was an infantry battle, and Taiwan will be an infantry battle. Really, tanks are not very relevant. So we're so focused on, you know, the big logistics. I think the Admiral said it's all about, you know, increasing the lodgement. Sure, if we were going against the Wehrmacht and had to drive to Berlin, that's not the case here. This is going to be about urban combat, mountain combat, special forces and paratroopers, small, not small units, but coming in by small boat. Steve, you can easily deliver small boats from any general fishing boat. And believe me, China has a very extensive maritime militia, so that they could easily deliver, I would say, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of troops. I'm not even talking about the airborne and heliborne attack, which would also involve, to my estimate, could be as large as 100,000 troops. So to me, the idea of the lift question is well overstated.
And if I can just add, Steve, a few things about ISR. You know, what can the United States
ISR,
see?
what's ISR?
Sorry, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So this is what you're referring to. Like, what did the United States know? Well, the first thing is going to what Lyle said about deception. So when we talk about now, you know, 25 bombers going to the center line of the Taiwan Strait, all this military activity, to me, I completely agree. This is why it's not even included in my article. I don't see this as a sign of an impending invasion. These are just signaling devices, but it does make it so these types of large scale things become more routine. So the next time we see like huge amounts of Chinese assets being prepared, we think this is just another one of their exercises. Moreover, a lot of this mobilization is happening, you know, we have to have assets in place to see it, and we have to have assets to process the intelligence. There was an article recently by General Van Herk in War of the Rocks, the commander of NORTHCOM, in which he talks about the fact that one of the main problems is that maybe 80% of intelligence that we collect, we never analyze. So we just don't have the capability. So you have to have the satellites in place at the exact time. You need to see things moving, sometimes from inside the country. You need to put all these pieces together, and you need to do it in a timely manner. And then you need decision makers who are relatively risk acceptant, who will say, okay, it might be the case that this is just an exercise. This might be the case that they're, you know, doing a massive mobilization exercise. They're not really going to do this, but I'm going to take actions to flow US forces in the region, which could be seen as escalatory. That could potentially spark a conflict that wasn't going to happen to begin with. So there are some operational situations, but there's also, I think, the political scenario, which can delay US decision making. And that makes it hard. I mean, also, no president's going to want to fire the first shot on China if China hasn't fired a shot on the United States. So they're going to delay that as long as possible.
When you say signaling, what are they signaling? You said the bomber flights are signaling. What are they signaling?
I think they're signaling that they are not the China of 1995, that they're not afraid of the US military, and that they can and are willing to fight in a Taiwan scenario. And if they did fight, that this, you know, it would be immensely costly for the United States. So the United States should stay out. I think that's a large part.
Are those flights correlated to what the Chinese see or violations of the unofficial contact rules with China, that when, you know, Secretary Pompeo throws out the old contact rules and suddenly China starts running lots of planes up to the midline, when we have more official contact, the Chinese then run more? Is there some correlation there?
So I'll let Lyle sort of weigh in. I'll just say that when I've talked to the Chinese military, for example, about this issue in the South China Sea, it looks like there's a correlation because they always move in a timeline in response to the United States does. But in a lot of cases, these are things they wanted to do anyway, and they're just waiting for an excuse so they can say that they're legitimate in doing it. But I don't know, Lyle, if you have a different.
I think Ariana's certainly correct that the high exercise pattern partly is designed to create an environment where they can easily mask an attack. That is, there's always exercise going on. At this point, there's always planes flying through the ADIZ and circling Taiwan. They've established a regularity to that. So, I mean, it will make it that much harder to see when a real attack is underway. And I expect all of those to ramp up and up and up as we go. I do want to raise one caution with the ADIZ, that's the Air Defense Identification Zone. Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, if you look at a map, it's very large. And it also covers areas, that are very close to the Chinese coast. And we talk about egress of China's Air Force and Navy into the wider Pacific. You're going to run through those corridors. So, I mean, to me, we should differentiate between flying through the ADIZ and going across the midline. But by the way, for the last year and more, China has very openly declared that they're ready to send jets flying right across Taiwan proper, which would be an incredibly escalatory move. But I do believe that's in there. They have a very, deep book of escalation measures. I'm not sure ours is so deep, but they view this as kind of testing our will constantly. And some of that is going on. One thing I want to disagree with that the Admiral said, I'll respectfully disagree with him, that he said we're on a kind of a good glide path with, Taiwan has changed its defense strategy and they're preparing in earnest now. I don't see that. I see the opposite. They have spent well under 2%. That's well documented over the last 2 decades. I mean, that's, it's as pitiful as our NATO allies. That is the contribution or facing the kind of threat they're facing. That's not impressive at all. I don't think, to the Chinese. And, you can see, look what they're putting their money in to. They just, for example, put a huge amount of money into a giant landing ship. I suppose that will go down to the South China Sea and resupply their garrison or something like that. But why on earth, maybe Taiwan is planning to invade the mainland? Really? I mean, why would they put a lot of money into a large landing attack ship? I mean, China's doing that, but I don't think it makes any sense for Taiwan to do. And, another thing, their F-16s, for example, I think they just bought a new cluster of those. In my view, those will never leave the ground. Air bases will be destroyed, and so will Taiwan's Navy. So as far as securing air and naval supremacy, which the Admiral said is a prerequisite, I agree with that, but I see no problem at all for mainland China to secure that supremacy in air and sea, certainly in the first month of this operation.
Funny question. I mean, today's news was full of Secretary calling out the Chinese Microsoft hack in March. What are the implications of that for cross-strait relations? As I was thinking about our panel and thinking about this, what does it all mean in terms of kind of the military balance across the strait, or is it just another negative development in U.S.-China relations?
Well, I do think so. There's one thing that would convince me that China is probably going to wait, and that is their drive towards self-sufficiency, financial, economic, and technological self-sufficiency. So a lot of the moves in the United States that started under the Trump administration that seem to be continuing under the Biden administration, with financial punishments or trying to hold back certain technological advances from China, which I agree with all those moves, but that has sparked this situation within the country in which they've sort of realized they don't want to rely on the United States and their allies for these types of things. And so Xi Jinping has laid out a series of plans for this degree of self-sufficiency. So I would watch that. If it does look like the trend lines are such that they're going to be more self-sufficient and therefore more resilient against economic, financial, technological sanctions in a couple of years, I think that would be a reason to wait to initiate this conflict.
Lyle? Well, I agree with Professor Mastro in the article. She said that the coupling, I think, and this increasing self-sufficiency, I think, gives China greater confidence that they can withstand. They're less dependent on our market. Well, then that's all okay. So I do worry about some of these measures. I do, on the unquestionably, worsening U.S.-China relations, that's part of this. And I think China, the worse U.S.-China relations get, the more they see conspiracy here. That is, Taiwan is the cork in the bottle of their rise, if you will. So that's dangerous. But I mean, more at a particular level of the economics here on the tech side. And, Taiwan is a leading fabrication center of microchips, and China wants this technology. And I do worry that there is now almost like an additional incentive for China to attack Taiwan. That is, they can take over these fabrication facilities, which raise the ugly possibility that maybe a U.S. war plan, I shouldn't speculate, but that they would have an incentive to even destroy those plants. But that would be terrible. But one last thing I'll say here is, when we think about whether China would go or not go, and that's really what I think Oriana's great article is about. But to me, we do have a little bit of worry that if we're talking about Fortress Taiwan, that is, Taiwan's digging ever deeper, buying more and more missiles to defend itself, that China decides it's actually better to go today than a year from now or 2 years from now. Because before, let's say, all those anti-ship missiles arrive, by the way, they did order a big shipment. I think that will be in 2023 or something like that. So, I mean, to me, that raises some ugly possibilities about windows closing and so forth. So that's other too.
Gay Christopherson asks about Russia's potential role. What do we know?
Well, I do a lot of work on Russia, and I can say just briefly that, look, Russia is very aware of China's interest in Taiwan, let's say, and they do follow Taiwan's, as it were, they follow Beijing's line here pretty closely. Look, they are concerned, and not just on the military side. They have real economic concerns that this could be a huge blow to the global economy, and they're looking to grow their economy. So, but in general, I would say Russians are happy about this tension, not to be too cynical, but they see this as an enormous distraction, well, for both countries, but mainly for the U.S. It sort of pulls military resources away from things that they care about, like Ukraine and so forth. Now, what will Russia do in this circumstance? I think they will supply China with weaponry and send fuel and other things. So I do think, this gives China some confidence to have Russia behind it. But I don't expect Russia to play a critical role in the Taiwan scenario. I certainly do not expect them to get involved in the war in a kind of as a combatant. Yeah.
If I can just add, because I just finished this year-long project on the Russian role, and I agree with everything Lyle has said. I would just say that I think their role would still be critical, even though it's not combat oriented, if this becomes a protracted conflict. So a lot of the scenarios we've talked about, these fait accompli quick situations, I don't see the Russian role being particularly deterministic, but because they are close enough to China, they think they're willing to take some international criticism or pressure to continue to supply China with that weaponry. And now their defense industries are becoming more and more mutually supporting as they engage in more joint development and joint production. So it's possible that China can kind of think of Russia as a strategic rear, where they get weapons from China, they're also getting oil and things like that. And that puts the pressure on the United States to disrupt China's war machine. Are you going to attack Russia? I mean, that is a level of escalation that the United States might not be willing to take. And then they could also do things. They've done all these joint air patrols recently. China and Russia could engage in, like, not support in the war, but do things like, to maintain peace and stability in this area, we're going to continue these defensive patrols. But that would also kind of close off that area to the war fighting. So that could also complicate planning.
But could I also just comment? I definitely agree with everything Professor Mastro said, but I would also add there's one more possibility here, which is Russia could help on the front of deception. I would not be surprised at all if President Xi calls President Putin and says, hey, look, we're very serious now about doing this in a month. We need you to make a very high level distraction in the Baltic or Ukraine. Please make a lot of noise. And actually, Russia did engage in this actually just literally a month and a half ago or 2 months ago. They had a major buildup in Ukraine and got a lot of people looking in that direction. Well, that kind of deception, I could see that on many fronts, but I could easily see Russia and China collaborating in that kind of deception. And I have to say, I think it would be hard to see through that.
Dongmu, you asked about these couple of military cargo planes that have come into Taiwan, U.S. military cargo planes that landed in Taipei in the last week. What's going on there?
Well, I could just comment quickly. I haven't seen a lot of U.S. explanation. It seems to me, we continue to push boundaries there on what is acceptable. I myself have been, to me, that's been going on since 2016 at least. To me, that is not a wise policy. I will tell you, I've been reading a lot of Chinese military press in the last 72 hours on this, and they are very, how to put it, there's a lot of harsh rhetoric flowing across the Chinese airwaves these days, and a lot of people banging their fists saying, I guess from the Chinese point of view, this is, to them, they're saying this crosses a red line. So, I mean, to me, this is quite dangerous, and we want to avoid this kind of escalation.
Have we had military transports landing in Taiwan before?
I think it has happened a couple of times before. I believe some senators recently traveled, but it's been rare. I think very rare. Maybe it happened twice before, but I think I have there's no question in my mind that the Chinese follow these minute points very carefully, and they, a lot of this is about symbols. At what point is the U.S. military back in Taiwan? For them, they have said that is one of their red lines. So I mean, to me, that's what's kind of scary here, folks. In my view, is that we don't have clear red lines. We could say maybe their red lines are not entirely clear. Well, what happens? That is how you sleepwalk into a war. I'm very concerned about that. The parallels with 1914 to me are very real.
I think Armitage, Dodd, and Steinberg went on a military transport when they visited Taiwan. This, delivering the, message from Biden.
I think it just highlights, though, that so this is one of the obvious weaknesses of my piece that people have pointed out, a critique that I agree with, which is credible threats are central to deterrence, but so is reassurance. And I argued when I testified for the USCC in February that I think we should have a change in posture, but not policy. I explicitly do not think that there should be any changes to US policy on Taiwan, whether it's a move towards strategic clarity, I think is a horrible idea. Anything that suggests that the United States might be reconsidering its position is extremely dangerous, and so Kurt Campbell can come out and say, I think it was he who said, the United States does not support Taiwan independence, or, we support the one China policy, but our actions also speak very loudly. And if you're on the Chinese side, you have a different narrative in your head, and that is of a declining power. Wars are caused by declining powers refusing to give up their positions, that their power is less and less, their position is stronger than their power. It's less commensurate with their actual power, and that they'll launch a preventive war against you to stop your rise. And so they see a lot of these movements as evidence for a potentially dangerous and aggressive United States. And so I think reassurance is absolutely critical. And it's very unfortunate that tensions between the two countries have reached the point that they've affected to a degree the people-to-people relationship, but also COVID has had a huge impact on that. I really do hope that we can get back to much more engagement to try to help with that reassurance component at the individual level, which of course is something that the National Committee does quite extensively and effectively.
I absolutely agree. I've been puzzled, actually. So you had Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell both reaffirming the one China policy, reaffirming not supporting Taiwan independence. At the same time, we've had what I would consider, not major, but peculiar actions, whether, the visit of the American ambassador from Palau to Taiwan. I don't recall sitting American ambassadors going to Taiwan. The meeting of the Chargés, well, it's not truly a Chargé in Tokyo, but the Taiwan representative meeting with the Chargé in Tokyo. Not completely throwing out the Pompeo rules on contact. So the administration says, well, we got rid of the rules. Well, not quite. They didn't go back to the status quo ante. So it's actually risking the political. Lyle, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think another complication here, I agree with everything both of you said there, but to to me is another complication here, which is Japan's role, and this has been in the news a lot lately. And I would say, as I read Chinese writings, this has also really inflamed the debate in Beijing again. Look, Japan ruled Taiwan for 50 years. Li Denghui served in the Japanese army and spoke Japanese fluently. This is, how to put it, a red hot issue. And I'm very, how to put it, I think it's quite disturbing here how this could, we don't want to pretend this is all about what Washington does at all. There's other players here, and again, this to me looks a lot like sleepwalking into a war.
So, I mean, Laura Lerman asked in one of the questions, she said, what is the impact of these statements by Japanese leaders? And I guess, Lyle, what you're saying is not good, that we probably should have been more careful in how we approach that.
Yeah, I mean, my real concern here is, that in the Chinese mind, this is one reason why Taiwan becomes a central focal point of Chinese nationalism, not the South China Sea, not sort of the Korean Peninsula or the Sino-Indian. Why Taiwan? Well, partly it is because, in the Chinese mind, this is where, the Japanese aggression against China began, if you will, in the Chinese mind. So that's why it's so, I think, deleterious here to have those kind of statements. And I'm concerned because a lot of American strategists seem to have concluded that Japan is the key. So the more we push Tokyo to make such statements, the more we have deterrence. In my view, this could really end badly for us, as it just exaggerates the escalation spiral.
We only really have time.
I think the big, yeah, I'm sorry. I would just say, I think the big issue is this outdated view that communicating resolve enhances deterrence. China has now planned for war even if the United States intervenes, right? Even if other countries intervene, it's now a question of capabilities. So I agree that these statements coming from Japan are not helpful, but if the Japanese involvement was such that they would credibly be involved in an actual contingency to defend Taiwan, I think that would enhance deterrence. But making sort of provocative statements, I don't think we're even close to being there. It does not help operationally. And I think the administration thinks that it signals resolve, but again, resolve is not, I think, the main factor that we need to be signaling.
But what I always find most difficult to kind of wrestle with is how much of what China does is a reaction to kind of the perceived violations of, the three communiques, and and how much of it is part of a plan. So it's like, Oriana, you say, well, he can't wait. Well, my view is more, if you don't provoke, he can wait a long, long, long time, certainly the rest of my lifetime. So give your view of kind of why he can't wait. Oriana.
So the first sort of I think it would be extremely tempting if, again, you sort of agree with my logic that this is possible, that you could succeed at achieving the greatest goal that China has ever had at an acceptable cost. That's extremely tempting. Xi Jinping in his other activities has demonstrated, I don't know the internal workings of his mind, but he's demonstrated his relatively risk acceptance for the sake of great gains. And I think it's also, this is sort of non-scientific, but it's human nature. If you could have something now, like I just moved over to Stanford from Georgetown, and my tenure clock, they're going to give me 5 years. Am I going to wait 5 more years before I go up to for tenure? No, the second I get my second book under contract, I'm going to go up for tenure, right? I just don't think this idea, it's as much of a myth as convincing China it's better off if they're number 2 to our number 1. Like, if you can do it, you can succeed, and he gets that glory. I think it's extremely tempting. And that's why the article is called The Taiwan Temptation.
I know you've got to run right now, but so let me just let Lyle give a last word on that issue.
Well, I would just say I agree wholeheartedly with Oriana, and I think we can imagine circumstances where there'd be even more of a temptation. I think, for instance, if China's COVID response was like a catastrophe, perhaps they would feel greater need to prove the party's wisdom or something like that. But I would say here I would add to her fine article that the military now is a kind of interest group that very much is pushing, I think, they have this nice budget, they have all this fancy kit, they want to show their stuff, they want to show their loyalty to the party, they want their heroes and martyrs. Yes, martyrs. It's sad but true, and unfortunately, we know that military organizations tend to be inclined toward more offensive strategies, and I think we have that in China, we have that in the US, but we also have that in China, unfortunately.
This has been a fabulous program, fascinating. I've learned a ton. I see our entire audience stayed with us the whole time, so that's a testimony to how riveting your comments were. I think this is an incredibly important issue, one which needs to, glad you've written about it, glad you will continue to write about it, and glad the committee can be a platform for what I thought was a very interesting discussion of this issue. So thank you all for joining us. Oriana, we will let you get back to your duties now, starting at, is it now 7 a.m. there?
Yeah, I hear the rumblings of the baby, but no screaming. So we've gotten lucky, right? Things can break your way. You give it a try, and if they break your way, that's all good. So thank you again for having me. This was a great discussion, and always a pleasure, Lyle.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice to see you all.